Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a slider in React using the Pokemon API and use a custom hook to fetch that data and put it in your slider. So let's dive right in. So I've created the scaffolding in Code Sandbox and I've provided this mockup to effectively use as a wireframe to create the slider. So what we're doing is displaying 5 Pokemon cards, and what we're going to do is create a previous and next button as well that lets the user go to the next Pokemon while keeping track of all the Pokemon. And then it will be disabled on the last and first slides. So for instance, on this initial renderer here, we want to have the previous button disabled because there's nothing before the first Pokemon and then at the last Pokemon. So we are going to be using the PokeApi here. I've already created a basic fetch function here. It uses the API and limits it by default to the first 15. And we're also going to be using Typescript. So I have also created the result, which could be either a object with the data of Pokemon, which is an array of Pokemon type. Let's dive into that, which is right here, which is each Pokemon type object is going to be an object with an ID, number, and an image URL. And we are going to be using React as well. And we can just get rid of this and dive right in. So what we're going to do is replace this first. And let's take a look at our mockup again. So we have a slider, kind of carousel right here, and then button. So let's just go ahead and start creating the markup first. So let's throw everything in a div or a main element. And then in here, we're going to call this a slider or carousel. And then we're going to have a container for buttons. So let's just add a class name in there as well called button container. And the cool thing about Code Sandbox is that you can use emit. So I'm just typing in dot and then the class name, and then I'm going to press tab, and it creates a div with that class name, which is pretty cool. And in here, we're going to have 2 buttons. And we're going to call this button. And add a class name of button. And then we're going to want to have 2 buttons. So we're going to do apostrophe and then 2 and press tab. It's really cool. And then we have our 2 buttons. And what we're going to do is this previous, text of previous, and give this a text of next. Cool. So we can see we have the basic mark. And then we can flesh this in a second. So what we want to do first is call the API somehow. So we have this fetch Pokemon function. And what we want to do is call it and grab this data. So what we're going to do here is create a function called, let's say, get Pokemon. And we're going to make this an async function because we are calling it. Another async function here. And we're going to want that data. So let's just call that data. And we're going to call fetch Pokemon. So before we do some data handling, let's go through what this fetch Pokemon function is doing. We're wrapping everything in try catch. So if there's anything going on, we can return an error and log the error as well. But if it's working, what we do is we do a fetch call on the API endpoint. And we have some query params going on. We have limit of 15 by default. And we are awaiting that fetch function and grabbing the server response and then transforming that into JSON because that's what we can use in JavaScript. And then we are destructuring that into results because that's what the Pokemon API or the PokeApi returns. It's an object, the results, and a couple other things. So we really only want the results. And within the results, we have this URL list of several Pokemon. So what we do then is promise all the array of Pokemon URLs, grab those server responses, and then promise all through or map through all of those promises and then transform them into JSON. So what that does is we get details for a list or an array of Pokemons. And what we're going to do is only grab what we need for our purposes, which is the ID, the name, and then the front default image of that Pokemon. And then what we do is then return upon everything being successful, we'd return an object with data, which is that formatted Pokemon right here, and then error of null. And again, like I mentioned, if there's an error, we do data null and then error is error. So let's go ahead and grab here, and then let's console log out data. Oh, and then we need to call this function too, right here. And we have promise pending because we have not awaited this. There we go. Now it should work. Sweet. We got 15 of something. Let's check this out. Perfect. So this is exactly what our type of Pokemon should be here, which is ID, name, and image URL. Perfect. Okay. So what we can do now is create some local state that we can throw this in. So let's create, let's call it Pokemon, and then set Pokemon. It's going to use state. And then we can actually add a type to this, which is going to be Pokemon type. And it's going to be an array of that. And the initial one is just going to be an empty array. And it's probably also a great idea to create a loading state. So we're going to do is loading, set loading. And then we're going to do useState of false. Cool. All right. So let's do some. So as soon as this fires, we want set loading to be true. And we then want to grab the data, which is an object with data or not. So actually what we're going to do is destructure out the data. And now we have that flat array. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say if there's data, and let's say data.length. That means if there's multiple data, then we're going to do set Pokemon to that data. And then we're going to set is loading to false. Cool. So we have our data coming in, which is awesome. Now what we need to do is just go ahead and render it. So what we're going to do now is create a new component called Pokemon slider or carousel. Let's call it carousel. Just new file, call it carousel. And we're export that. And we're going to add some prop types here. So we're going to type props, and we're going to do Pokemon. And that's going to be an array of Pokemon type. Let me just grab it from here. Fetch a Pokemon type from types. Wonder why it's not auto importing, but no worries. And that's going to be an array. And how we set these props is we can say that this is a React functional component with the type of props. That means we can just go in here and have our autocomplete ready, and we can see that Pokemon is available. And what we're going to do now is make sure that Pokemon is length, meaning there's stuff in that array, then we want to do something. Then we want to map through those Pokemon. And it's going to be individual Pokemon monsters. Let's call that mon. It's the iterable. And then we're going to go ahead and for now, let's just create a div. and oops, call that Pokemon. And in here, we're gonna just for now Pokemon name, and then we're gonna do mon dot. Cool. All right, and then let's put that in here. Let's clean up our imports a little bit. Let's move this down. And then carousel from carousel. And we want to add in Pokemon prop. And then we also want to do create a div here as the loading state. And then we're also just going to assert that Pokemon has length at the root level here. Actually, we are already asserting that Pokemon has length here, so we should be fine in just making sure that it exists. And as you can see, we have a list of the different Pokemon, which is pretty cool. So now what we want to do is create some images for it. Let's create an image element here, and mon.image URL. And I also want to give it an alt tag, so it'll be name. And we also want to give this a key. In React, it's very important to make sure when you're mapping through things, you want to give them keys. So ID. And then we also will need a number. So let's do Poke. And that'll also be the ID. And I want to go back to the mockup just to show you why we need a number. We are just going to place that number right here. Cool. So awesome. We have the images being loaded, and we have our numbers and titles. So let's go ahead and see what we want to do with the slider. So we have get Pokemon, get slider. Okay, so let's go ahead and do some basic styling. So we want to go to our style.css and take a look again what we're doing here. So we have carousel. Maybe let's do and give us a max width. Let's say 800 pixels. Actually, let's give our main area max width 800 pixels and a margin auto. Perfect. And then our carousel, let's just give it a background to make sure that we see where it is. Pink. Perfect. And then we want to give this a display of grid. And we want to do grid template columns of, we want to go 5 cards at 1 fraction. Perfect. So we have 3 rows now. So again, we don't want to show all cards. We only want to show 5 at a time. So before we do that, let's clean this up a little, give it some padding or some gap of 1 rem. Perfect. And then let's style the Pokemon card a little as well. So Poke, it's padding of 1 rem. And then we are going to positive, a position relative. And then the reason for that is because we can then style our number, position of absolute, and top, the quarter rem from the top, and quarter rem from the side. 5. Perfect. And let's just make this a little bit small. But make this a little bit bolder. Okay, cool. What I also want to do is give this a background of white, and then give the whole main area background of light. Gray. Oops, give the Pokemon card. There we go. Gray. So maybe you should do that to the body. There we go. Okay, cool. And then where do we do pink? Let's get rid of that pink. And while we're here, let's also style the buttons in the button containers. So button containers and button. So the button container will be pretty easy. We just display flex, align item center, and justify content space between. Perfect. And then let's just give this some margin. 2 rem. Perfect. And let's style the buttons. Let's get rid of the border. Let's give this a background of and let's go and click into here. Yeah, that works. And then give it some padding. And I think we're set. Now that I think about it, it's looking a little too flushed out. Sorry, a little too what's the name? It's a word for it. Saturated. So let's give it a little bit. That works. Or yeah, that works. Cool. So now what we want to do is make sure that we're only showing 5 cards at a time. Now, how we're going to do that is by tracking the first index, or meaning like the first or the slide index of the first card in the slider. So we can do that by going back to our app.js and let's just call it slide index and set slide. And then that's going to be our use state. And of course, it's going to be 0 as the initial slider. And what we want to do now is create a function that grabs the visible Pokemon. So in this case, the initial visible Pokemon would be the first 5 cards here, 1 through 5. So let's create a function here. Get visible Pokemon. And we're going to first check that if Pokemon has length, meaning it's loaded, then we're going to do something. If not, return an empty. So we're going to then return a new array using slice. And this is going to go from slide index to slide index plus 5. So it'd be like 0 plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what's actually going to be a better idea here is if we create this into a variable, so then we can easily update it later if needed. So let's call that slide length or slider length. Cool. So now we can then grab the Pokemon here, and instead of passing in Pokemon, we just passed that method. Whoops, it's perfect. Cool. So now we have our first 5 Pokemon, which is really cool. And the beauty here is we're still only calling that API once, which is awesome. So now we want to work on updating the functionality or adding the functionality for these previous and next buttons. First, what we're going to do, we're going to spell previous correctly. And then we're going to go back to the CSS real quick and give this a class of cursor pointer. That way, when you look at it, or when you hover over it, you can see that pointer cursor. One more thing I'd love to do is add some hover states. So do button, hover, and then for accessibility reasons, do button dot focus. And here we're just going to darken it up a little bit, or lighten it actually. There we go. There we go. Cool. In our case, let's darken it. There we go. Perfect. And now you can see that we can tab over them and they highlight as well. Perfect. So let's do some functionality here. Now what we want to do is create handler functions here. Let's start with the previous button. So let's see. We're just going to hook this up to this as an on-click handler. And let's just console log something out, make sure that works. And let's go ahead and click that. Beautiful. Okay, cool. And let's do the same for next. Oops, on click. Beautiful. And sure. Beautiful. Okay, cool. So go ahead and let's figure out what we want to do for previous. So what we want to make sure to do is check where the slide index is, because if slide index is 0, meaning this is the first card, we don't want this to update any slide index or do anything. In fact, we want it to be disabled as a button. So what we want to do first is create a check for the state. So we want to make sure that slide index is greater than 0, because if it's at 0, we don't want it to do anything. And then if it is greater than 0, then we want to set slide index to be 1 minus whatever the slide index is. For instance, if it's 3, we want it to be 2, so forth. And then, like I mentioned, we also want to disable this button if slide index is equal to 0. Perfect. Like right now, we have disabled it. One more thing I'd love to do in the CSS is make sure that we only do this for enabled. We don't want any hover states. Beautiful. And in fact, what we want to do is disabled. We just want it to be background gray. It's gray. Light gray. Beautiful. And in fact, we want it to be cursor not allowed. That way you see a big cross. Perfect. And so let's go back to the buttons here and work on the handle next. So what we want to happen here is if it were just a single item slider, meaning every time you press next, it just shows one total instead of 5 Pokemon total. We do something like Pokemon length -1 if it is smaller Pokemon length -1. But in our case, we actually want to make sure that it's going to be disabled after the length minus the slider length. So in our case, if the index or the slider index here is 10, we want the next to be disabled because we've got the last remaining Pokemon already showing invisible. So let's put that here. And then here we can just do set slide index to slide index +1. Cool. See if this works. Perfect. But you'll see that it is not showing the new Pokemon. Now, why is that? Let's go ahead and start debugging this. So yeah, I just figured out that, or I just realized that the slide shouldn't be at the slider length always because we're, no matter what the index is, only going to that slider length. What we want to be doing is going to slide index plus that slider. So now, yep, we should be getting all of these images. Now, before we go into the rest of the code, we're going to do two things. So we're going to add disabled state for the next button. So again, that's going to be the slide next. We want to make sure that if it's Pokemon dot length minus slide index. And so if it's 10 in our case, if the 10th slide goes here, right here, we should be seeing that the next button here is disabled. It's pretty cool. Awesome. So one more thing I want to do here is just clean up the CSS a little bit more. We're seeing that the image here, I believe it is called Pokemon. We haven't given it a class name, so let's give it a class name. We want to make sure that that's centered. Pokemon number. And lastly, we have our Pokemon name. We just want to capitalize that. And center it up. Perfect. Let's see if this transparent. Perfect. Yeah, I think this is looking good for our case. Actually, let's make this inlay a little bit more. And let's give this line height of 1, exactly where it needs to be. And I think we're good. Okay, cool. Now, the first thing we want to do now is first congratulate ourselves because we built a working slider using the Pokemon API and have learned how to create a slider using React hooks and the Fetch API, which is really, really cool. Now what we can do is start cleaning up the code base a little bit more. One thing we can do right off the bat is create a custom hook that handles most of this. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's call that use Pokemon. We're gonna effectively just copy over a lot of this. Import this. Cool. And we want to return pretty much all of this as an object. So Pokemon set Pokemon. slide index, slide index is loaded. Let's see if we want to set Pokemon anywhere outside of. Yeah, actually, we don't need to pass down set Pokemon at all. It's just Pokemon, slide index, set slide index, and I believe that's it. Do we even need. No, I don't believe we need slide index outside. So here's what we can do. We can also do create const is next button. Pass those in. That way we won't need slide index outside of this hook. Cool. Okay, so now let's create our useEffect. Effectively, let's copy this whole thing. This and import. Wonder why that is not importing. No worries. Here. And let's go ahead and export default use Pokemon. Limit. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Let's see. All right. So let's see what set index is 0 and slide index slider length. So we're going to export slider length. And its previous button disabled, so that slide index is 0 minus slider length. Actually, I think we can just move this. And we can also create a couple of things here. In fact, we can do what we can do is instead of doing is set slide index, or instead of passing that through, we can do on pref click. And move these. This. And we also need to do get visible. So we have a bunch of stuff missing. But the beauty of this is going to be we just call it use Pokemon. I believe. I believe I need to do this. and then pref click on this click. It's loading. Is next disabled? Is previous disabled? And let's just plug those in. And get. Prep click. And let's click. And let's go back here. Make sure is. Oh, perfect. Cool. Let's make sure this all still works. Awesome. This is looking really, really cool. So this was a lot that I just threw at you. So let's break this down and talk about why this is much more beneficial and in much more clean code. Um, so with React, you want to make sure, and with really any kind of code, you want to make sure that you have a separation of concerns. So we have our app in more real world scenario or a larger code base. This would maybe like be a page level component or a container component where you are calling that page level or like kind of scaffold or scaffolding. And then you have your visual components laid out, and they're what people call or used to call dumb components. They don't really do anything, but what you're doing is passing in functions. So for instance, like a button, it's just a style button, but you're passing in that function. And then you have a custom hook where all your business logic is happening. So we're only passing through what like specific things we need and nothing more. For instance, we're not dealing with any local state outside of this hook. Any local states outside of this custom hook, because we don't really need to use it or see it. For instance, if you have, say, like maybe strictly front end or like HTML, CSS, maybe some like designers only know front end in the scope of HTML, CSS. We don't want to have them go through our JavaScript business logic. We just want them to be able to work on the visual components. And then we can go in here with a JavaScript developer or more like higher level developer and handle the business logic here. And what this also allows us to do is make our tests much more specific in their roles, meaning this visual component here, we can just mock everything. If we're doing a unit test for this app component, what we can do is just mock everything coming in from this hook and assert that all of this markup is being rendered with the correct data. And then we can also create a unit test for our specific hook and mock the network responses. Make sure everything here is being handled correctly. And then we also have our carousel, which we also split out, so we can assert that everything here is being done correctly, and everything is in easy, manageable chunks that are much more easier to understand. So yeah, thanks for watching, and yeah, I hope this was very informative to you. If you have questions, as always, you can reach out to me in the comments. I'll make sure to reply and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.